How long did the children of Israel actually spend in Egypt? For many Christians and Bible students, if you ask them this question, they would most likely refer you to one or two main passages to provide their answer. The first passage many turn to comes from Genesis chapter 15 and verse 13, or its similar New Testament reference, Acts chapter 7 and verse 6. And when you go to Acts and look at this passage, here with a careful reading of Stephen's words, we can see that he is telling us that he is referring to Genesis chapter 15 and verse 13. So let's go firstly and look at Genesis 15. And we read there in verse 13, "Then the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. Going to Acts chapter 7 and verse 6, Stephen tells us, "And God spoke to this effect, that his offspring would be sojourners in a land belonging to others, who would enslave them and afflict them 400 years. Both of these passages clearly seem to state that the children of Israel were in Egypt for a total period of exactly 400 years. The second passage many turn to is Exodus chapter 12 and verses 40 and 41. And again, it's slightly similar New Testament reference, this time Galatians chapter 3 and verse 17. And again, a careful reading of Paul's words here tell us that he is also referring to the time period mentioned in Exodus chapter 12. So let's read Exodus 12, picking up in verse 40. We read there, "The time that the people of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of 430 years, on that very day, all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt." Going now across to Galatians chapter 3 and verse 17, we read there, "This is what I mean," Paul says, "the law, which came 430 years afterward, does not annul a covenant previously ratified by God so as to make the promise void." But straight away, we have a problem. Genesis and Acts seem very clear in stating that the time period is 400 years. And yet Exodus seems equally clear in stating that the time period is 430 years. So which one is it? Is one of them wrong, and we have a contradiction in the Bible? So looking at what we have read so far, we really are left with just three choices. Firstly, that the time period is 400 years, and the Exodus or Galatians references are wrong, or we are misunderstanding them. Or, secondly, that the time period is in fact 430 years, and then the Genesis and Acts references are wrong, or we are misunderstanding them. Or the third option is that neither the 400 nor the 430-year time periods are correct, and we are misunderstanding both of them, and there is some other time period. And so with that introduction, let us dive in and examine God's word as he expects us to when we come across apparent contradictions in the Bible. After all, we know that God expects us to be like the Jewish Bereans, and we are told of them. In Acts 17 and verse 11, "Now these Jews were more noble than those in Thessalonica." Why were they more noble? Because they received the word with all eagerness, examining the scriptures daily to see if these things were so. So now before we look to uncover the exact time period the children of Israel were in Egypt, and then look to examine the four passages and their apparent contradictions, let's look at an interesting few verses which straight away set an absolute outer limit for the time period they could possibly have spent in Egypt. And the passages I'm referring to are firstly Exodus chapter 6 and 5 verses from 16 to 20. And here, when we read these verses, we are reading about the names of the various sons of Jacob with some of their descendants and the ages that they all lived to. And so we read, picking up in verse 16, "These are the names of the sons of Levi, according to their generations: Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. The years of the life of Levi, being 137 years. So Levi, one of the sons of Jacob, had 3 sons, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari, and he lived to 137 years. Going on from there, the sons of Kohath, so looking at the second son of Levi, the sons of Kohath, he had 4 sons, Amram, Ishar, Hebron, and Uzziel. And the years of the life of Kohath being 133 years. So Kohath had 4 sons. The oldest is Amram, and he lived to 133 years old. And then Amram, we're told, took as his wife Jochebed, his father's sister, and she bore him 2 sons, Aaron and Moses, the years of the life of Amram being 137 years. Now, taking that together with this passage, we need to add just one other. And this is from Genesis chapter 46 and verses 8 to 11. And we read there now these are the names of the descendants of Israel who came into Egypt. So when Jacob came to Egypt to settle there, he came with all of his sons and a whole lot of his grandsons, etc., and their various wives. And we've been told about this in Genesis 46. Carrying on from there, dealing specifically with Levi, the sons of Levi, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. So what are these 2 passages telling us? Well, a number of critical points. Firstly, the children of Israel, including Levi, and he was Jacob's 3rd son, arrived in Egypt together with Levi's 3 sons, who had already been born before they arrived in Egypt. And these 3 sons, as we saw, were Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. And we pick this up in verse 11 of Genesis 46. Further, Kohath, Levi's 2nd son, lived a total of 133 years. We see that in Genesis 46, verse 18. Amram, Kohath's 1st son, lived a total of 137 years. We see that in verse 20. And Amram, we're told, had 2 sons, Aaron and Moses. Now, in addition, we know that Moses was 80 years old when the children of Israel left Egypt. So that's when the Exodus happened. And we find this in Exodus chapter 7 and verse 7. So if we put all this information together and take the absolute extreme, and obviously this is not practical as we'll see, but I'm just taking an absolute extreme. So if we assume Kohath was born to Levi 1 year prior to the children of Israel arriving in Egypt. Why do I say 1 year prior to that? Since his younger brother Merari still needs to be born. And so if Merari is going to be born after Kohath, Kohath had to, as an extreme, at least been born 1 year prior to them arriving in Egypt. And so Kohath would have been 1 year old at that point. Remember, we're looking at extremes here. Secondly, and now we get into the really sort of weird extremes, but bear with me. Assume Amram was born 3 years prior to Kohath's death, since Amram's 3 brothers still needed to be born. So we need another 3 years for his brothers to be born, and then Kohath dies. So Kohath would still have to be around in order to conceive both Amram and his 3 brothers. And again, here we're assuming that literally on his deathbed almost, or at least just a year prior to his death, he managed to conceive the youngest son. And again, that's hardly likely. And so if that was the case, Kohath was 130 years old when Amram was born. And then lastly, as our extreme, assume Moses was born just before Amram died. And so Amram was 137 years old when Moses was born, conceived when Amram was 136. And so based on these 3 highly unlikely assumptions, the absolute maximum we can stretch out the time period that the children of Israel were in Egypt would be made up of the following. We would have 129 years from Kohath arriving in Egypt aged 1 to the birth of Amram when Kohath was 130 years old. We would then have 137 years from the birth of Amram until he had Moses on his deathbed. And then we would have 80 years, which was the age Moses was when they left Egypt. And so this gives us, when we add all of these together, gives us the absolute maximum time period possible for their stay in Egypt. And it would give us a time period of 346 years. This is somewhat short of either the 400 or the 430-year period most people believe was the time spent in Egypt. And from this we can immediately conclude that neither the 400-year period nor the 430-year period can be correct, and we have to be misinterpreting both these passages. Further, the actual time period must be somewhat shorter, and we need to put on our Berean caps and dig a bit further into Scripture to resolve this puzzle. So let's start by looking at the 400-year period mentioned in Genesis and in Acts and carefully examine what it is and what it isn't telling us. So the Genesis record occurs in the promise God gave to Abraham of Isaac and his offspring as he made that covenant with him. And so I'm just going to reread that verse so it's fresh in our minds again. So verse 13 of Genesis 15, then the Lord said to Abraham, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. And as we said before, it does at first reading appear to be an open and shut case that we're being told that the children of Israel will be sojourners and afflicted for 400 years. But we saw when we examined the lineage from Levi to Moses that this period is impossible. So we must be careful not to jump to conclusions before we have examined this and other passages. So, what is it and what isn't it telling us? Well, it is telling us, firstly, that Abraham's offspring, not Jacob's note here, Abraham's offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs. And so this must apply to Isaac and onwards through Jacob all the way to those that finally came out of Egypt. And when we view this through that lens, it starts to make more sense. We are also told that they, this is Isaac, etc., would be sojourners in a land that is not theirs. Now this aspect is well spelt out for us in Hebrews chapter 11, where we are told of Abraham that by faith this is Abraham, he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. And verse 9 of Hebrews 11 says, these all died in faith. This is Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they, who's the they? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were strangers and exiles on the earth. It didn't matter in what country Abraham or his descendants found themselves. They were sojourners. We are reading into Scripture something that is not there if we say that they were only sojourners while in Egypt. Our second point, the part about being servants and afflicted, also needs to be understood in that it is describing aspects of what happened to them during that 400-year period, not what happened the entire time. Remember, for example, that Joseph was alive for 71 years after the children of Israel arrived in Egypt. He was 2RC to Pharaoh. He was the most powerful man outside of Pharaoh in the whole land of Egypt. He would have looked after Jacob and all of their descendants. He would have made sure that they were not persecuted, that they were not servants, that they were not afflicted. And so we wouldn't dream of calling that period, at least, of being a period of affliction. But it is part of the period they were in Egypt. And likewise, too, this servants and afflicted equally applies to Isaac. And in what way was Isaac servant and afflicted during his life? And our third point, so this 400 years needs to be understood as applying from Isaac to the Exodus, and as the period they were sojourners, whether that was in Canaan, Egypt, or anywhere else. The aspect of being servants and afflicted applies to periods of time during the 400 years. But more specifically, the end part and somewhat after Joseph had died. And what do we read in Exodus chapter 1 verse 8? Sometime after Joseph had died, a new Pharaoh arose who did not know Joseph. He did not know Joseph, and that's why he then started making the children of Israel servants and afflicting them. But that period of being servants and afflicted occurred sometime after Joseph's death. and when this new Pharaoh arose. Our second related passage is no different when carefully analyzed. And this is the Acts chapter 7 and verse 6. And again, just reading, and God spoke to this effect, that his offspring would be sojourners in a land belonging to others, who would enslave them and afflict them 400 years. And again we note, it applies to Abraham's offspring, and that's therefore Isaac and onwards. Secondly, the land that belongs to others is not specifically meant to apply to Egypt, but anywhere they found themselves in the Middle East. And thirdly, being enslaved and afflicted, again, is a description of some part of the 400 years, not all of it. The sojourning, however, can be seen to cover all of this period because they never owned any land. And so if this 400-year period is applied to Isaac and up until the Exodus, then the start of the 400-year period is most likely from the day Isaac is born. And so included in the 400-year period is Isaac's life from his birth up until Jacob is born, which is when Isaac was 60 years old, and we read about this in Genesis 25 and verse 26. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. We also read that Jacob lived up until he entered Egypt for an age of 130 years old. And we pick this up in Genesis 47 verse 9. When Jacob arrives in Egypt, he goes to meet Pharaoh, and this is what he says to Pharaoh. He says, the days of the years of my sojourning are 130 years. And he means by that I'm 130 years old at this point when I'm arriving here in Egypt. And note as a quick aside how Jacob refers to his entire life up to that point, living outside of Egypt, as being one of sojourning, never having a fixed home or base. And that's true in terms of what we saw with the 400 years. And so this gives us an easy calculation to work out the actual time period from when Jacob arrived in Egypt until the children of Israel left. And so we take our 400 years, subtract from it the 60 years that Isaac lived up until he had Jacob, and then we take the 130 years from Jacob's birth, when Isaac was 60, all the way to his arrival in Egypt at the age of 130. If we take off that 60 and that 130 off the 400, we end up with 210 years. And this time period fits comfortably below the outer limit we established from that Levi-Moses lineage. But what about the period of 430 years mentioned in Exodus chapter 12 and Galatians 3? How do we explain the apparent contradiction with the 400-year period, and how do we reconcile it with our reasoning so far? And again, with some careful inspection and pulling together some other verses, it all falls into place, and we come up with an interesting additional piece of information. And so again, just reading, so it's fresh in our minds, Exodus 12 verse 40, the time that the people of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of 430 years, on that very day, all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. So this verse really does seem to be specific in stating that the entire time that the children of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. But we must be misunderstanding what we are being told here. Otherwise, we have a major contradiction in Scripture, as we have pointed out. Now, fortunately, Paul helps us out, and he tells us what this 430 years actually represents. So look again at Paul's words in Galatians chapter 3 and verse 17. This is what I mean, Paul says. So he's really trying to tell us here to concentrate. This is what he means. We need to understand this. The law, which came 430 years afterward, does not annul a covenant previously ratified by God so as to make the promise void. And the key word here is afterwards. If we can establish what Paul says occurs 430 years prior to the giving of the law, we can resolve the puzzle. So piecing these two passages together, we have that firstly, the 430-year period ends at the Exodus. We see that in verse 40. The law was given to the children of Israel when they came out of Egypt, and that's the date of the Exodus. And we see this in Galatians 3. The covenant or promises to Abraham Paul is telling us, were given 430 years prior to the giving of the law. That's what Paul is telling us in Galatians 3. So in Paul's words, the law was given 430 years after God gave Abraham the promises or covenant. And we need to understand that when we read Exodus chapter 12. And so why is Exodus chapter 12 and verses 40 and 41 so confusing? Well, the King James puts the verse 40 probably a lot better. And we read in the King James Version, now the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt, was 430 years. So the phrases children of Israel and who dwelt in Egypt are merely descriptions of the people. They are adjectives and are not meant to be read as actual detail. And interestingly, if we have a look at the Septuagint version, we read there the sojourning of the children of Israel and of their fathers. That's the addition that's added in the Septuagint. And of their fathers in the land of Egypt. And then in the Samaritan version has even more added in. The sojourning of the children of Israel and of their fathers in the land of Canaan and in the land of Egypt. And so again, when we look at these, we can begin to understand how the Jews actually understood and interpreted this verse. And we are meant to understand that the sojourning is dealing with Canaan and Egypt, and in this particular case, Abraham himself is included in the sojourning, beginning from the time when he received the promises in Genesis chapter 12. But recall that Abraham received the call in Ur. And so we're just going to pick up from Genesis chapter 11, verses 31 to 32, just to set the context. We read there that Terah, who is Abraham's father, Terah took Abraham his son, and Lot the son of Haran his grandson, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son Abraham's wife, and they went forth together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go into the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Now, reading chapter 12, after these verses, I think we can conclude that Abraham received the call from God in Ur, left there with Terah, and stopped in Haran. And it's interesting to just look at the words there. They settled there. When you settle somewhere and you, in effect, drop anchor, you don't settle for a few days or maybe 2 or 3 weeks. Settling requires months or years to spend in a place. So they settled in Haran. They spent a significant amount of time there. And why did they spend so much time? We're not told, but perhaps Terah became sickly or too frail to continue with the journey. The intent when they started out was to head to Canaan. But obviously in stopping at Haran, he maybe became sickly or frail, and they decided to stay there. And out of duty to care for his father, Abraham stayed with him in Haran until he died at the age, we assume, of 205. And only then did Abraham pack up and leave Haran at the age of 75 years old. But what we are not told is how long they stayed there in Haran. So going forward now to Genesis chapter 12 and covering verses 1 to 4, we read there, now the Lord said to Abraham, go from your country, and that country was Ur of the Chaldees, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And in verse 4, Abraham was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. So note that Abraham was not 75 years old when he left Ur. Many people make this mistake because they forget that there is a time period in which they settled in Haran, so that there's a time period between the time they left Ur and Abraham left Haran. But what we are told that he was 75 years old when he left Haran. So this leads us to conclude that if the 400-year period started when Abraham was 100 years old, remember Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born, the promise in Ur must have been given to Abraham when he was 70 years old, meaning he spent 5 years in Haran before Terah died and he left there. And that would make a lot of sense. And so when we lay this out in a graph, it looks like the following. And so we see the 400 years from the birth of Isaac, when Abraham is 100 years old, all the way through to the Exodus. the 430 years from the promises given to Abraham in Ur all the way through to the Exodus. And it's 430 years to the Exodus, 430 years from the promises given to Abraham to the giving of the law, as Paul explains to us in Galatians. Now, there's one other time period that can be added to this, and it occurs in Acts chapter 13. And here in Acts 13, Paul is addressing the Jews in Antioch, and he says in verses 19 to 20, "And after destroying 7 nations in the land of Canaan, he," that's God, "gave them their land as an inheritance." All this took about 450 years, Paul says. And after that, he gave them judges until Samuel the prophet. Now, if we piece this together with what Caleb tells us in Joshua chapter 14 and verses 7 to 10, and here we read, Caleb says to us, "I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land. And now, behold, I am this day 85 years old." So what can we piece together from this and other references? Well, firstly, Caleb was 40 years old in the 2nd year after leaving Egypt. So 2 years after the Exodus. And that's when he was sent with the other 11 spies to spy out the land. Therefore, 38 years later, he entered the promised land. 38 years later, from his age of 40, would make him 78. So remember, the total time that the children of Israel spent in the wilderness after leaving Egypt was 40 years. So the 2 years up to the spying and a remaining 38 years. But he told us that he was 85 years old when they finished conquering the land. And so that allows us to work out how long it actually took them to conquer the land. It took them 7 years to do this. 85 years old when they'd finished conquering the land, minus the 78 Caleb was when he arrived in the promised land, gives us 7 years to conquer the land. If we now assume a further approximately 3 years to mark out, to divide, to give out the land, to appoint the judges, etc., probably not unreasonable, a roughly 3-year period, we would then have 50 years from the Exodus to the start of the judges. The 40 years in the wilderness, the 7 years to conquer the land, and this approximate 3 years to divide up the land and ultimately end up appointing the judges. And with our 400 years from the Exodus back to Isaac's birth, we then have now about 450 years. And so we can now see how neatly all these figures fit together if we correctly interpret what period they are dealing with. And inserting our previous time period of the actual stay in Egypt, we have the following. And so after carefully examining various passages, we have the answer to our question. How long did the children of Israel actually spend in Egypt? And the answer is 210 years.